Well, hello. My name is Robert Farrell, LPC Supervisor, and welcome to Supervision. On this one, we are looking at the DSM. This is just going to be an introduction. I'm not going to go into details about the different categories that are in it. I just want to cover some of the history and some of what makes it kind of important and valuable to us as counselors. So, having said that, welcome to Supervision. If you are one of my LPC associates, then I probably am asking you to watch this. If you're not one of my LPC associates, then you're welcome to watch, of course. Put feedback online, that's fine. This is non-monetized, and so it is intended to increase knowledge and awareness for LPC associates that are entering into the field and learning. I've been in the industry of counseling since 2006, and I first got into mental health as a worker, care advocate, that kind of thing, in 1990. And so I've been around this aspect of mental health for a long time. In any case, I want to cover this today kind of in general, not going into real heavy depth, looking more at history. So having said that, let's move on. So we are going to look at the history of the DSM, where it came from, how it got started, and why it is the way it is today. Because it has changed a lot since the time I first got in. When I first got into the field of mental health, we were on the DSM-3, the green one there at the top. And frankly, it was a lot thinner. You can't really tell very much by looking at that one, that image, but the DSM-3 was a huge step up from the 2. You can tell that part, but from the 3 to the 3R to the 4, and the 4TR now to the 5, they have steadily gotten thicker and thicker. And so, but in any case, the history of the DSM is really kind of fascinating. You can spend a lot more time going into this detail and learning about it. Okay, so the pre-World War II time period, kind of important. A lot of this began back in the 1840s. The U.S. Census in America identified classifications of idiocy and insanity on their listing as for people that couldn't work and the reasons why they were unable to function. Of course, their early classifications would now be labeled as inappropriate identifiers. The label of idiocy went and became it became mental retardation, and there that term got changed to an IDD classification, whereas insanity is now a legal term, not normally used with regards to mental illness, although there is a forensic crossover there because you're dealing with the law as it pertains to mental health. So the 1840s is when things got started. And you'll see in the picture there, we've got Freud on the left, you've got Jung, and I don't remember off the top of my head each one of those guys, but every one of them had an input into the DSM as we know it today. They are the early foundation of American psychology and psychiatry. So let's jump forward to 1880. The U.S. Census again went out. This time they did something really cool. They created 7 categories for mental disease that included some names you may be familiar with, such as mania, and some names you may not be familiar with, such as monomania, meaning a single occurrence, dementia, you've heard of that one, dysbomania, don't hear that one anymore, and epilepsy. We hear about that one, but we no longer classify it as a mental illness. It is now classified as a medical disorder, not a problem of psychology, more of a problem of biology. In any case, So that was the 1880 U.S. Census. Now let's jump ahead by a couple more years to 1917. At this point in time in history, the U.S. had what was called the American Medico-Psychological Association, and they combined with the National Mental Hygiene and the Census Bureau to do another review of national statistics. And so they took all of that census data and the 7 categories, and they started compiling information. Actually, it was kind of a stroke of genius, in my opinion, simply because they started realizing how prevalence and how people's environment began to affect them psychologically. So the research was really starting to kick in 1917. It was really fascinating. 1921, we have our first big change. The American Psychological Association is born out of the Medical Psychological Association. They began to separate themselves from the medical industry and become their own entity, in the US at least. What they did at that point in time was they created a short list of some very detailed disease classifications where they could standardize their symptoms, and they found a lot of similarities, commonalities, and correlations between regions, as well as what schizophrenia would look like in Texas versus what it would look like in New York. And what they found was it looked the same. And so it's really kind of interesting how they came up with a common nomenclature, a common vocabulary, so everyone would be talking about the same thing at the same time. This is an important aspect to recognize because in our world now, words are, for some reason, taking on new definitions that don't exist, and words do have meaning that we need to be on the same page. Okay, post-World War II. Now, let me talk for a moment before World War II. The U.S. Army found during World War I the shell shock phenomena. Every one of you have talked about this in your classes. You've had in your master's program, and if you had an undergraduate in psychology, you've heard of this as well. So what happened here was the U.S. Army got very involved in the study of psychology because of the Veterans Administration. We had a lot of young men coming back from World War I that were completely traumatized, and the psychology and the medical world was trying to figure out what's going on. So what they did is they brought together a lot of research and incorporated a lot of other aspects. So to include the World Health Organization, the WHO, they had developed what's known as the ICD system, the International Codex of Diseases. And at that point in time, they had gotten up to the ICD-6, and it was the International Classifications system that really allowed the organization concept for the DSM to take on a whole new. Up until the DSM-5, we had our own system of coding different mental illnesses. But the DSM-5 then branched off into using the same coding system that is used internationally, and so now our codes are all different. So in any case, that's an important connection there. So let's go into 1952. Or you know what, before I do that, let me back up. The U.S. Veterans Administration had identified 10 different categories of psychosis that was in conjunction with the shell shock phenomena. And on top of that, they had also created 7 categories of character, behavior, and intelligence disorders. So early on, as 1952, they had begun putting together these classifications and recognizing the complete different nuances of them. It's an important aspect to take account of after World War II was when they started really compiling this information. So The APA took this information and added in 1952, created their list, which I guess we would really at this point in time call it just the DSM, the first edition. It's very, very thin kind of outline paperwork, but they continued to influence and get more information as time went by. So moving into the DSM-3, noticing the green one there and then the blue one, the DSM-3 revised, and the DSM-4 and the DSM-4 text revision. These are interesting developmental aspects that took place. Having the DSM-2 that had already been developed after 1952, it got later on published in the DSM-3. So these were just stair-step approach to more information getting published, put out. So I want to read this kind of carefully because there's a lot of overlap, and I put notes on this one for myself. So the DSM-2 developed and then was later published in 1978. So they started work on it in the 1950s, but it didn't get published until 78. So that's a huge jump from 52 to 78. Now, here's the interesting aspect. It got published in 78, but the DSM-3 was being developed in 74. So they already recognized immediately how this information needed to be put together, and there was so much more that needed to be added. The DSM-3 then got published in 1980, only 6 years later. And then, interestingly enough, the DSM introduced a lot more innovations, a lot more criteria, and just came up with a much more detailed orientation. Now here's where things start to separate. Let's go to the World Health Organization's use of the ICD-9. At this point in time, they're using the 9th version of the International Classification of Disease, and they did not use a multi-axial diagnostic approach that the American Psychological Association was using and was putting into the DSM. Because of that, the ICD-9 and the DSM didn't match up on every aspect. More importantly, the ICD-9 did not add diagnostic criteria. It was simply a book of numbers and the codes that would be going alongside of the diagnoses that were available. Now, that's where they separated. They've come back together. Okay, the DSM-5, like I mentioned a moment ago, is now in line with the ICD-10. They're on the 10th version, and I believe they're going to be coming up with the 11th version probably in the next couple of years. In any case, so going back to the DSM-3, that one uncovered some issues and fixed a lot of problems with regards to the classification in disorders. They needed more time to research, so they threw together basically the two, knowing that the 3 was going to be available in a few years' time. It's still like that. They're constantly getting ready for the next one. So in any case, the DSM-4 was then published in 1994 after 6 years of really intense study on how to improve the categories, how to improve the nomenclature, the terminology. And that's when the book really started getting thick, because they started adding a lot more basic information to really help the clinician, the diagnostician, the psychiatrist, the psychologist to get much better clarified images. All right, so now we are at the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 text revision, which is where we're currently at. The 5 began being put together in 2000. Now here's where things got really interesting. They put together a task force, if you will, of 13 different work groups, each one focusing on different areas of categorized mental illness. And that way they improved the development of guidelines and standardization so that what we read here in Texas would be the exact same thing that was read and understood in all the other parts of the country. Now, interestingly enough, in the spring of 2019, this task force began to look at the text revision. Even though they were coming out with the 5, they already began looking at the text revision. Specific areas that were looked at for modification included diagnosis of a couple things, cultural aspects, sex and gender aspects, suicide, as well as forensic aspects. And then the text revision of DSM-5 was published just this year in March of 2022. Okay, so the organization of the DSM, need to look at that for just a moment. It is organized fairly simple and straightforward. It's broken into 4 sections. Section 1 is on the basic aspects that include things such as the use of the manual, how to use the book. Very important that you as an LPC associate read that section, because otherwise if you just dive in, it will be a little confusing to you, because there's some parts of it that are really heavy. And if you're going to be going into the DSM clinically, if you're working at the hospitals, you will want to do this. So you need to really be aware of how the book is laid out and the way it's formed and fashioned. Also, cautionary statements for forensic use are in that section. I'm going to summarize that in a real simple sentence. Don't do it. So forensic aspects of diagnosis are requiring a lot of specialized training and a good bit of experience in the field to be able to know how to put them together. And that's something that you want to be very cautious with. Okay, Section 2 is the diagnostic criteria and codes for billing. And frankly speaking, that's where the meat of the DSM is at. That's where you're going to spend most of your time reviewing, looking at the criterias, looking at the differential diagnosis. What rules out a diagnosis? What rules in the diagnosis? What would prevent the diagnosis, such as a general medical condition? We have to remember, medical always takes a precedent over what you're dealing with. Okay, so Section 3, this is the section where the next revision is going to take place. They give us a heads up and say, hey, these are the emerging measures and models that we may be thinking of changing and adding or modifying. They give us a warning of what's to look forward to. And then our last area is the appendix. And this one here, it's actually really beneficial. You get a glossary of terms, you get your nomenclature, you get some concepts, a list of codes that you can find things alphabetically as well as numerically. The appendix is just a good place to go looking for rapid information. Let's say you already know they meet criteria, but you don't remember the code. You can go looking it up there, or you can then go from there to find the page number that it's actually on. So the layout of the book, if you haven't gotten one yet, you're going to want to get one. I haven't had a chance to pick up the text revision yet. I'm going to hold off probably a few more months, mainly because the revisions that they've done are not massive, and they've already been published in the Emerging Measures Section 3, so I already know what they are. I'm going to be doing a video on that pretty soon as well, what has been modified, which basically includes a section on complex prolonged grief, a section on non-suicidal injurious behavior, in other words, cutting, and then there's some forensic aspects that they've added as well. So here again, guys, this is just an introduction. I'm going to wrap it up at this point in time and again say welcome to Supervision. If you are one of my LPC associates, I will see you in the group supervision that we have every Tuesday, and or I'll be seeing you in our face-to-face sessions that we have once a month on top of the group. So in any case, guys, until then, keep doing what you're doing, stay ethical, and follow the codes, follow your the TAC code and the ACA, and we'll stay in touch.